Welcome to Have a Life Teaching, the podcast designed for educators who are dedicated to enhancing their teaching practice and creating a positive impact on their students' lives. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the world of education, exploring a wide range of topics related to curriculum, instruction, and assessment in K-12 schools. Together, we'll learn from the brightest minds in the education field. So if you're a passionate educator who's ready to take your teaching practice to the next level, join us as we explore the exciting world of education. My name is John Shimbari, signing in and saying, let's have a life teaching. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining Have a Life Teaching podcast today. Really glad to have everyone joining us for this exciting episode. So the other day, I had the opportunity to coach two instructional coaches whom I've been working with for some time in a district that's struggling a little bit in retaining teachers. And so the problem that these instructional coaches have is the fact that not only do they need to teach, but they have to run their PLCs. So in the course of our conversations, I suggested that they don't necessarily have to run everything themselves or do everything themselves in their PLCs. They could be delegating and having people assuming different roles in the PLC work, in the professional learning community work. But it goes much beyond that. If we really want school innovation to take hold, if we really want to innovate the process of teaching and learning, our PLCs are going to require much more than just assigning people different roles. We're going to have to really think through what we're doing and how we're teaching, and perhaps some different ways that we might want to up our teaching game. And so I'm really excited today to have an expert in design thinking. So we're joined today by Dr. Justin Reich from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he is not only assistant professor of computer and media studies, but also the executive director of the MIT Teaching Systems Lab. So Justin, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, John.
So Justin, I like to get right into things. So could you tell us a little bit more about your background and how you came to make design thinking your life mission, if you will?
Sure. So I'm a former high school history teacher. I actually started my career teaching wilderness medicine. Kind of a funny thing about teaching wilderness medicine is I taught these short courses, a course called Wilderness First Aid and Wilderness First Responder. They were 2 days or 10 days, and I teach them to outdoor leaders, to doctors who are going on remote missions, to military personnel. And the way my job was set up, I taught these same two courses over and over again for a few years. And what that meant partly is that I just taught the same lessons over and over again. So there would be a lesson about teaching people what to do if someone breaks their leg or twists an ankle, and how to improvise a splint out of your backpack. And I might teach that lesson 40 or 50 times in a year. That's actually quite different from how most teachers experience their career, where you teach the lesson on factoring polynomials in October, and you'll teach it again the next year in October.
Right.
Well, it turns out if you teach the same things over and over again, you can get really good at it. You can get strikingly good if in a 1-year period you can teach the same lesson 40 or 50 times, especially, this is the most important part, if you're intentional about introducing some systematic variation every time you do it. If you say to yourself, this is the thing I'm going to try to make this a little bit better. So it wasn't that common. It wasn't that uncommon for participants at the end of one of those classes to say, oh, wow, you're the best teacher I've ever had. This was really incredible. And a big part of it was just, well, I had an awful lot of opportunity to practice. So I've thought a lot about how to bring that mentality into my work with my own students, into my work with schools. And then as I started teaching at MIT, I realized that approach to small scale, rapid iteration experimentation, that's all across MIT. All of my colleagues in science and engineering in the business school, that's how they invent new products, how they imagine new services, how they create new businesses. I think there's a lot that we can learn from that kind of approach for improving schools.
I love it, Justin. And something you said that really stuck with me there when you were talking about getting really good at teaching the same lesson 50 times. I think what you said next was key. As long as you're adapting that lesson for the immediate needs, right? And that is really, if you think about it, what we as educators should be doing, thinking about how we're always going to improve our craft, right? And realizing that, sometimes we're going to have to, do trial and error. We might make some mistakes along the way. But ultimately, if we keep trying to tweak our lessons to meet the needs of the students that we actually have sitting in front of us today, as opposed to the ones we had last year and the ones we're going to get in 5 years, we can really become better educators. So could you describe a little bit more then what the design thinking process is? Because you have this great book coming out, by the way, called Iterate, which is really about the design process and getting better at what we do. Would you mind sharing a little bit more about the overview of that?
Sure. So Iterate is a book which is inspired by, the full title is Iterate, the Secret to Innovation in Schools. And it's the idea that when we want to get better at something, oftentimes the best way is to have multiple cycles of trial, iteration, and feedback. None of that's going to be surprising to teachers who ask their students to do those kinds of things all the time. And the challenge is figuring out how to adapt that to the world of schools. Part of what makes bringing a sort of human-centered design approach to schools difficult is that schools often operate, they kind of naturally operate on these pretty long time cycles.
Right.
Our courses take years, our students develop over 12 years. The other thing which is really difficult is we do really different things from day to day. If you're a sixth grade earth science teacher, like you're doing plate tectonics for a week, and then you're doing meteorology for a week, and then you're doing science for like space for a week. Those things are really different. Part of what I want to try to help educators do is to think about how can we tackle improvement not in these huge impossible chunks. It might be an okay thing for schools to have 5-year improvement plans and those kinds of things, but none of us really live in 5-year improvement plans. We live sort of day to day. And so sometimes I describe this as the someday Monday dilemma. We want our schools, our teaching to be a lot better someday, but we can't send all the kids home for a few weeks and retool everything. Like the only improvements that we can make are the ones that are feasible to do by Monday. So we have to figure out how can a series of small shifts lead to bigger kinds of change. And that means being deliberate about those small shifts. So part of what we have to do is figure out how can we find targeted areas of innovation in which we can try small manageable changes and have those small manageable changes spiral up into bigger things. How can we think about improvement less as a series of lines and narratives and more as a series of cycles and spirals? How can we try to orient our thinking so that when we're testing something, it doesn't feel like this huge, heavy burden of like, this is the thing we're going to try, but more lightweight, low cost, low time investment, find to fail kind of experiments, where through a series of those, we sort of figure out the right steps. And then how can we think about how we bring lots of different voices into our innovation efforts, voices of students, voices of our colleagues, voices of community members, so that we're listening to lots of stakeholders, especially the most marginalized stakeholders in our communities, as we're thinking about trying new things. And then, so those are sort of 3 of the big principles in the book. And then the way the book is structured is that there are 3 cycles to play around with. One is called the cycle of experiment and peer learning. One is called design thinking for leading and learning. And one is called the collaborative innovation cycles. And they all vary a little bit, but they're all approaches to iterative improvement that can be used by teachers, by teacher leaders, by principals and school leaders.
I love it, Justin. So in terms of a school that's interested in doing this and starting this cycles work, this spirals work, let's say tomorrow, what would be a strategy that you would recommend to get a school going well, or a department team going well in design thinking? What would you recommend they do? How should they structure their day?
Yeah, I'd have to talk more about them, about where they're at, but 2 places that you can think about starting are how do we get better at experimenting and how do we get better at working together? If the thing that you wanted to get better at was experimenting, that's more about what the middle of the book is about using design thinking for leading and learning as a way of saying, how can we get better at doing small scale, iterative, prototyping, testing, innovation. And a lot of times I have folks start that by taking on design challenges that are outside of their classrooms and outside of their education. So an exercise I like to do in a few hours is to introduce people to design thinking by having them design a morning routine for a colleague or design a vacation for a colleague. What teachers learn pretty quickly is that almost all of the parts of design thinking teachers know something about and have a bunch of experience with. It's often the case that science and math teachers know an awful lot about prototyping and hypothesis development and testing and evaluating. English and social studies teachers tend to be really good at empathizing with people, understanding their problems, imagining new futures. Like teachers come to design thinking with a ton of experience. And so part of what the book does is just help people recognize the skills that they already have and bring them to bear on developing approaches to getting better that focus on small, lightweight, iterative steps to improvement rather than things that feel big and heavy and hard to fail and impossible to do. Now, if you get people good at experimenting and everyone experiments in their own direction, that sometimes is not great for people getting better together at the same time. So another set of things to work on is how do we pull our oars in the same direction? Schools actually have, almost every school has lots of educators that are pretty good at trying new things. Oftentimes, a harder thing to do is to get everybody trying to work on the same thing, at least at the department level, the grade level, maybe at the school level. That's what the collaborative innovation cycle is really about. There are lots of different steps and parts of that, but I'll tell you the first one is bringing people together around ideas they care about. A lot of times we do innovation to fix things that are broken, but actually many of the most successful efforts build upon our strengths and build upon the things that we care about the most. So there's an exercise that I do with lots of schools and districts and educators called 4 Questions for Innovation, which starts with asking people to brainstorm together about 4 questions. What are the learning goals that are most important to you? What are you most proud of about your school? What are the ongoing initiatives that are happening in your school? And then how could innovation improve what you're doing? And the key to that exercise is helping people realize that that 4th question depends greatly upon the answers to the first 3. The things that we work on should be tied to our closest values. They should build on our strengths, and as much as possible, they should align with existing initiatives rather than creating new ones. When people feel like they're working on things that are tied to their closest values, they're more, and to their biggest strengths, they're more likely to want to invest with them and move forward with them. Maybe one other theme that sort of is throughout the book is that, and you mentioned this when you talk about your instructional coach colleagues, we don't have a lot of time as educators. And a lot of the time that we put towards improvement is really in many respects discretionary time. Like the amount of contract hours that we have is less than enough to do our job. And so the time that we spend getting better is usually time that's being pulled away from other parts of our lives. The schools that are best at continuous improvement are ones where just the faculty really enjoy working together. Creating conditions for joyful collaboration is an essential part of doing this well, because when people feel like it's fun, when they feel like, man, like I have a good time working with my colleagues and students and community members, making school better, like that's a fun thing for me. That's when they find the time for it.
I love it. I love it. And, you said a lot there that as a consultant myself resonates. So when you were talking about, the design process not being something extra, but to use it to achieve the goals and the initiatives that you already have set forth in your school community. So yes, I totally agree. You're preaching to the choir in terms of aligning this design thinking work, not only perhaps to your strategic plan that your school has, but even hopefully if your school community was involved in creating the vision statement So that way, everything is aligned to those values and goals that you mentioned. But yet, your process, one reason why I think educators, if they don't have some kind of PLC process or design thinking process in place, they want to do, because it takes all that theory of and that philosophy of what we want our students to know and be able to do, and actually makes it a reality, right? Through this ongoing design process that you're mentioning. So if I could ask you, Justin, one thing that I struggle with when I coach folks around thinking in a design way is how they measure impact. How do we actually ensure that we are changing the game for our students and that our students are learning more based on the way that we are innovating? Because innovation's great, but if it doesn't actually lead to student achievement, why are we doing it? So what would you recommend for folks, for teachers, for educators, in terms of ensuring that this process actually leads to student change?
Considering measurement is enormously important. I spent a whole lot of years working with schools on technology integration. And the thing that I found, just descriptively, without trying to disparage anybody, is that there are a lot of schools and districts that over the last 10 or 15 years have made enormous investments in new technology and essentially have not evaluated whether or not it's improving teaching and learning. So I would say in a lot of my work with educators, with school teams, I really feel like we're trying to move from 0 to 1. That actually anything that you're doing to evaluate a new initiative, to assess a new initiative, is probably better than what you were doing the last time around. There are a couple of reasons why it's hard. We're always short on time. For a lot of educators, teachers feel like assessment evaluation has been weaponized against them.
Right.
And so we have a lot of not great feelings from the No Child Left Behind era and some of those kinds of things. But if you're serious about improvement, you've got to be serious about gathering evidence about whether or not the things that you're doing are working, and also be willing to say that they're not. I think I probably have two. So the two main messages I have for folks are: anything that you can come up with to evaluate what you're doing is probably pretty good. And the simplest methods of talking to people, if you're doing nothing, chatting with people who are closest to the problem and closest to the thing you're trying is a great way to get started. Right. So talking to parents, talking to students, talking to teachers, talking with other stakeholders, ideally not the people closest to you, ideally people that you pick in some kind of random sort of way, or even the people most at the margins. That's sort of one theme. I would say the second big theme, and there's all more advice on this in the book, is the most important things we do are to improve student learning. The place that we can best see student learning is in their work. And so really the thing we ought to be doing to evaluate new initiatives is looking at student work. We should be able to say, like, we did this to try to improve this kind of thinking, that we should see new and better kind of thinking on their spelling tests, on their reading reflections, on their lab reports, on their biographies, on whatever it is. And that doesn't mean that we then need, oh man, but we've got 147th graders. You don't need to read 140 biography essays, but you do need to randomly sample for them, and look at them really closely and say, does this look like it has the evidence of the kind of thinking and the kind of work that we were hoping to improve on? And to be able to be really open and honest with each other to say it's not happening. Actually, I have an example in the book. This was a bit of a more complicated exercise, but a colleague of mine, Bud Hunt, was a technology director in the 2000s when blogging and wikis were being more introduced in schools. And they implemented a school-wide blogging platform, and they'd done a really good job of having a pretty clear vision of what they wanted that to look at. Like, they wanted to be a space for student self-directed writing about questions of importance to them, where people could develop an identity in authors, things like that. Like, really, they did a pretty good job being pretty clear about what they thought good work would look like. Bud has access to the back end. He takes a random sample of the post. It's implemented school wide, and so there's no way he's going to read the whole thing. We're not going to do that. he looks at a bit more than maybe a typical educator would do because he's doing his master's thesis, which a lot of educators are in any school district in any year. So that is a resource that people can tap into. And he finds something like, there are 5 times as many posts written by teachers as written by students, even though there are 20 times as many students as teachers in the district. And he finds that basically most posts sort of reproduce the kind of teacher asks the question, student offers a response, teachers evaluate the response, some kind called an IRE interaction or something like that. But basically, like, the blogs have become digital worksheets. They were the same kinds of interactions that were happening in other kinds of places. And importantly, then Bud could turn to his district and say, we're not doing what we set out to do here. And so we need to change the initiative, or we need to shut it down, or we need to decide what it is. But, with a reasonable amount of effort from somebody who had to do a master's thesis anyway, Bud was able to come up with pretty conclusive evidence that the kind of writing that students were doing wasn't what they set out to accomplish. And as many as possible of our initiatives should have that kind of assessment component associated with them. Can we look at even if it's small, a random sample of student work, and do we see the kind of thinking that we were trying to improve, or are we not seeing that? And, if we are, how do we build on that and grow? And if we're not, how do we make this initiative better? Or how do we try something else?
I love it. And just for our listeners, so they know, and you might know of this resource, Justin, I'm not sure, but the National School Reform Faculty Protocols online are free. And there are actually a few protocols there, if you go to their website, on how to look at student work. Precisely what you're saying, where you're not going to be looking at 157th graders' work. You're going to take samples of work that you think is below proficient, at proficiency, and perhaps maybe an example above proficiency. And to your point about and from the example you gave with Bud Hunt, you could really learn a lot just by looking at a few of those samples of work. So I'm really glad that you mentioned that, Justin. Let me ask you, are there any schools out there doing design thinking really well? And would you want to shout any of them out? And anything else that I didn't ask you that you want to really make sure that our listeners know about design thinking?
There are a lot of great schools that are out there. If a lot of people have heard of both High Tech High and Science Leadership Academy, which I think are both pretty extraordinary school systems. I also think you could say that, I probably have less pedagogical kind of intuitive affinity with them. But there are a lot of sort of no excuse charter school networks that are quite good at a bunch of things that I've described about having a clear sense of mission across people, about having a common language around instruction, about doing evaluation to see whether or not the things that they're doing are working. I mean, to some extent, it's a little bit easier for relatively new schools to engage in some of these processes because they tend to be more coherent. Our comprehensive high schools have, in Massachusetts, we have 150 years of our communities asking them to do one thing after another. And so it's a little bit harder to be as tighter in their focus. But another thing that I try to point out a lot is that every school community has places where terrific work is going on. I've never been to a school that didn't have folks that were doing some great experimentation, that didn't have folks that were doing some great peer learning. And so it's good to look externally. But another question to ask is, like, in our school, in our district, where are the pockets of excellence around improvement, or what are the things that all of us are best at doing? And then to your readers, I'd say I hope they check out Iterate, the Secret to Innovation in Schools. You can learn more at iteratebook.com. If you're going to publish this before September 20th, you can pre-order the book. And if you pre-order the book and go to that website and fill in a little note about where you got your book, I'll send you a signed book plate, and you can enroll in a free online course that I have going on this October 2023 about some of the parts of the cycles of innovation that we talked about.
Great. Thanks for that, Justin. And I'll make sure that the listeners get links to that. So, Justin, one thing we didn't talk about yet about the design process is the role of leadership. So we're talking about what teachers can do, but what should leaders be doing to ensure that this process takes hold in their schools?
So two really important facts about school innovation are that if you interview and survey teachers about who influences their practice, the number one answer is other teachers. If you ask people how they decide what they teach, the state, the curriculum, principals can influence that a lot. If you ask people how they teach, the number one answer is other teachers. That means that the way schools get better is through peer-to-peer teacher learning. That is the primary mechanism of school improvement. As for, in terms of teacher leadership, that means we really need two things urgently from teacher leaders. First, we need teachers who are willing to conduct experiments in their classroom with their practice to try new things to get better. And then we need them to teach and learn and share with one another. Those are the sort of like two essential components of making schools better. So if you are a school principal, you actually can't really do either of those things. There are not enough administrators in the building to conduct experiments in all of our classrooms. And as people become administrators, they lose their credibility as teachers with their peers. Teachers want to learn from other teachers. This is bad news too. Like if you're a consultant, like I was for a bunch of years, or anybody else who's outside the classroom, teachers mostly want to know from their near peers who are facing the same kinds of challenges they would. So if you're a principal, your job is to create environments where this kind of experimentation and peer-to-peer learning can happen. There's a metaphor that we have in the book of the merry-go-round. The teachers and the students are on the merry-go-round. They're doing the spinning. They're there clinging to the bars, hair whipping around, spinning around. And the principals are on the outside, sort of slapping the metal bars or grabbing the metal bars and running them around. And making that spin faster, spin more joyfully, spin more smoothly. There's a whole bunch of ideas in the book, but some big things are, how are you going to create an R&D budget for experimentation? How are you going to give teachers, students, community members resources to try new things? How are you going to encourage peer-to-peer learning? Two of the key elements of peer-to-peer learning are letting teachers get into each other's classrooms and then letting them look at student work together. How are you going to create school-wide environments sort of for institutional knowledge sharing? Where do you create the spaces that teachers can share new practices with one another? How could you look at your whole schedule of every meeting that you have all year? And what is all of the administrative stuff that you could reduce and replace with opportunities for people to talk and share and learn about their teaching? And then the other thing that teachers can do, that school leaders can do, is to make sure that your school has a shared instructional language, that you have some common way about talking about teaching and learning, and that you have a set of goals and values that people are working on together. And there's more details about all of those things, but I think the key things for principals to recognize is that, there's no school anywhere where a principal gets in front of a bunch of faculty and says, okay, we're going to do it this way this year. And all the faculty raise their hand and go, yeah, we're going to do it this way this year. This is great. Your job is to create the environments where teachers feel comfortable, feel safe, feel supported, experimenting with new practices. And then when things are working out, that they have time, space, resources, encouragement, enjoyment to be able to share that with others. There's a lot of complexity in how you do that, but in some respects, like school improvement is as simple as that.
I love it. And, schools that do it well, the schools that I've seen do it well, are those schools where the leaders do build in the design thinking process into the structure of the school day. So if that's a PLC, that they actually have a dedicated time in the schedule, not after school, not before school, once a week, where teachers can get together to have these conversations with their peers. Like you mentioned, that's how people want to learn. They want to learn with their peers. So thanks for answering that. So other than the book and what you were just mentioning, are there any other places where folks can check out your work?
Yep, you can learn more at the Teaching Systems Lab, tsl.mit.edu. And there's all kinds of stuff on that site. There's also a newsletter link that you can sign up for that can tell you more about what's going on there.
Great. Thank you so much, Justin, for your time today. This was really informative.
It was nice to talk to you too, John. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening today. I hope you got some great tips that you can bring back into your teaching. Remember, have a life teaching without sacrificing your own. Also, don't forget to subscribe and be well.